What happens when one of Hollywood's most admired performers finally reaches the point where patience runs out on live television? What happens when years of bottled-up irritation suddenly burst out in front of a nationwide audience? What unfolded became one of the most intense and unforgettable moments in daytime TV, when Robert De Niro lost his composure during what had been planned as a routine promotional appearance. It was supposed to be a standard interview about his newest project, but the conversation quickly turned into a heated confrontation that stunned the studio and ignited conversations online for weeks afterward. Even before De Niro walked onto the set of The View, the mood in the studio already felt uneasy. The acclaimed actor had come to talk about his latest movie, but observers could sense that something about his attitude suggested the conversation might not go exactly as planned. Joy Behar, known for her blunt style and willingness to challenge guests, appeared particularly eager to steer the discussion toward more controversial territory, rather than staying on the safe promotional topics usually expected during these appearances. The interview began with Behar greeting him using the nickname, Bobby, despite the fact that he had specifically asked during the pre-show briefing to be addressed as Robert. She smiled in a way that hinted she might push boundaries during the conversation. Almost immediately she shifted toward a political subject. She asked about remarks he had recently made regarding the political climate, noting that critics had suggested he might be becoming too outspoken for someone whose primary profession was acting. De Niro's expression stiffened slightly. Off-camera, his publicist shifted uneasily in her seat. This line of questioning hadn't been part of the agreed interview outline. When he responded, his tone was calm but carried a subtle sharpness. He said that actors had the same right as any other American citizen to express opinions about issues that mattered to them. He added that performers were not simply entertainers meant to remain silent about everything beyond their work. Behar quickly interrupted, leaning forward with a challenging look. She suggested there might be a difference between having personal opinions and using a famous platform to influence people who might not be as informed. The implication in her voice was clear and unmistakable. De Niro's hands resting on the arms of his chair tightened slightly as he repeated her word, informed, with noticeable emphasis. He asked whether she was implying that ordinary Americans were incapable of forming their own opinions and needed to be shielded from hearing perspectives that differed from theirs. Behar laughed dismissively, a sharp sound that echoed across the studio. She insisted that when someone with his level of fame speaks publicly, people naturally pay attention, and therefore he should consider being more cautious about what he says. His voice lowered into a quiet tone that anyone familiar with his films would recognize as a warning sign. Slowly, he asked her how long she had been telling viewers what to think on the show. The other hosts glanced at each other nervously as the tension climbed. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to lighten the atmosphere with a quick joke, but the moment had already shifted beyond easy recovery. Behar responded that she had spent decades in the industry and understood responsibility very well. De Niro corrected her firmly, reminding her that his name was Robert, not Bobby. Then he pivoted the conversation toward what he saw as the responsibility of journalists to ask meaningful questions instead of crafting situations meant to embarrass guests for dramatic effect. Her face reddened as the exchange continued. She had clearly expected the usual dynamic where celebrities soften their responses when challenged. Instead, he pushed back harder. Attempting to regain control, she suggested he might be overreacting and that the exchange was simply a discussion. De Niro immediately rejected that characterization. His voice rose slightly as he argued that a genuine discussion requires both participants to listen to each other. What she was doing, he said, was trying to engineer a quick sound bite that could make him appear foolish while allowing her to feel superior. The audience sat in absolute silence. The confrontation between one of Hollywood's most formidable actors and one of daytime television's most assertive hosts created an atmosphere so tense that even small movements seemed loud. Behar told him he needed to calm down, her voice taking on a tone that many past guests had found patronizing. That remark clearly struck a nerve. De Niro's eyes flashed as he listed the things that had irritated him: being invited under what he felt were misleading expectations, being confronted with loaded questions, being repeatedly addressed by the wrong name, and then being told to relax when he responded to the situation. Behar realized she had pushed him further than intended, yet pride kept her from backing away. She responded that if he couldn't handle a straightforward interview without getting upset, perhaps he should limit himself to acting and leave political commentary to professionals. That comment marked the precise instant when De Niro's patience finally collapsed. The shift was immediate and unmistakable. The calm exterior that audiences had seen throughout his career disappeared, replaced by raw intensity. The same fierce presence that had made his characters so powerful in films seemed to fill the studio, but this time it was not a performance. His voice thundered across the set as he repeated the word, professionals. Several people in the audience visibly flinched at the sudden volume. Leaning forward, his posture changed completely, radiating a focused intensity that the cameras captured in close detail. He told her that true professionalism involves preparation and respect. According to him, a real professional studies the subject, treats guests with courtesy, and doesn't sit smugly trying to make someone appear foolish on national television just to satisfy personal ego. Behar attempted to cut in, raising her hand dismissively, but his voice overpowered the interruption. He made it clear that he wasn't finished speaking, insisting that the conversation had crossed the line from an interview into something far less respectful. The studio remained frozen as the confrontation continued, everyone aware they were witnessing a moment that would be replayed and debated long after the broadcast ended. "You've been talking for the past 10 minutes and still haven't said anything worth listening to," he snapped. "You invited me here to promote a movie, remember that? Instead, you wanted to play your little tricks, throw out loaded questions, and when I don't go along with your script, you tell me to calm down." The other hosts sat stiffly in their seats, unsure whether they should interrupt or allow the confrontation to run its course. Whoopi Goldberg looked completely stunned, her mouth slightly open as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening in front of her. Sarah Haynes looked equally uncomfortable, shrinking into her chair as though hoping the cameras would somehow forget she was there. "You know what your problem is?" Niro continued, his finger now pointed straight toward Joy. His voice carried the unmistakable edge of Brooklyn that had made so many of his film characters unforgettable. "You think that being loud and obnoxious somehow makes you intelligent. You think cutting people off and talking over them makes you look tough. But all it really does is make you rude." Joy's face shifted from red to an even darker shade as the tension built. Her hands trembled slightly while she clutched the stack of note cards in front of her. "I don't have to sit here and listen to this," she muttered, her voice wavering. "Oh yes you do," De Niro replied instantly. "This is your show and you created this situation. You said you wanted the real Robert De Niro. Well, congratulations. Now you've got him." The studio had fallen so silent that the faint clicks of camera shutters could be heard as photographers documented every second of the explosive moment. "For 40 years, he went on, I've been appearing on shows like this. I sit there politely answering the same recycled questions again and again. Usually, at the very least, I get treated with some basic level of respect. But you, Joy, you decided to take a different route. You decided to be nasty." His voice dropped into a quiet, threatening whisper that still carried across the entire studio. "You sit here day after day tearing people apart, making snide remarks, acting like you're some kind of fearless journalist, standing up for the truth. But do you know what you really are?" He paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch. "You're a bully hiding behind a desk and a microphone." Joy finally managed to respond, though her voice came out thin and strained. "How dare you call me a bully? I'm asking legitimate questions." De Niro laughed sharply, a harsh sound that sent a ripple through the audience. "Legitimate questions," he repeated. "Was it legitimate when you implied that everyday Americans are too ignorant to hear my opinions? Was it legitimate when you kept calling me Bobby after I corrected you more than once? Was it legitimate when you told me I should stick to acting and leave thinking to the professionals?" Each question landed like a strike, and Joy visibly recoiled with every word. The audience remained absolutely still, absorbing the tension that hung in the air. "You don't ask questions, Joy," he continued. "You make accusations disguised as questions. You don't interview people. You set them up. And when someone pushes back, suddenly they're the problem." Even though no one in the audience spoke, several people could be seen nodding slightly. A few crew members off to the side struggled to hide their reactions as the exchange unfolded. "You want to talk about responsibility," De Niro said, his voice rising again as his frustration built. "Your responsibility is to treat people with respect. Your responsibility is to have real conversations. Your responsibility is to lift people up instead of tearing them down just for the sake of a reaction." Joy opened her mouth as if to reply, but he continued before she could speak. "Instead, every interview turns into your personal therapy session," he said. "You work out whatever frustrations you have by taking shots at the people sitting across from you. Well, I've got news for you, sweetheart. I didn't come here to be your punching bag." The word, sweetheart, dripped with such obvious contempt that the atmosphere seemed to tighten even further. Joy leaned back slightly in her chair, clearly caught off guard by the intensity of the moment. This was De Niro at his most intimidating, channeling the same commanding energy that had defined so many of his most famous roles. But this time it wasn't part of a performance. It was real anger, directed squarely at the host in front of him. The room felt almost like the tense pause before a confrontation on a city street. Joy's eyes widened, a mix of shock and anger flickering across her face. Before she could form a response, De Niro pushed forward again with relentless precision. "You think this is entertainment?" he demanded, his voice now controlled but thunderous. Every word came out clearly, deliberately. "You think humiliating people on television makes good programming? Let me explain something about real entertainment. Let me explain something about real storytelling." He slowly rose from his chair, and the energy in the studio shifted immediately. Even at 78 years old, De Niro still carried the commanding presence that had dominated movie screens for decades. Standing there, his focus locked entirely on Joy Behar, he seemed to fill the entire space. "When I make a movie," he said, "when I build a character, I do it for a reason. I do it to tell a story that means something, something that connects with people. Something that might make them think, or feel, or understand something real." He gestured toward the set around them. "But what you're doing here, this isn't storytelling. This is cheap cruelty dressed up like journalism." Joy tried to stand as well, perhaps thinking that matching his posture might restore some balance to the moment. But as soon as she rose, De Niro fixed her with such an intense stare that she hesitated and slowly lowered herself back into her chair. "Don't," he said quietly, and that single word carried a weight far greater than any shouted order. The firmness in his voice seemed to fill the room. For a moment no one moved. Then Whoopi Goldberg finally attempted to step in, her voice uncertain as she glanced toward the cameras. "Maybe we should go to a commercial break," she suggested, clearly hoping the pause might cool the situation. "No," De Niro replied immediately, without even turning his head in her direction. His eyes remained fixed on Joy. "We're not cutting away. Joy wanted this conversation, so we're going to finish it. Every part of it." Behind the scenes, the producers in the control room were scrambling. Some argued that the broadcast should immediately shift to commercials, while others pointed out that the ratings were skyrocketing as viewers stayed glued to the confrontation. The moment was chaotic and risky, but from a television standpoint it was impossible to ignore. De Niro continued speaking, slowly pacing behind his chair like a restless animal trapped in a cage. "You asked me about responsibility," he said, his voice steady but intense. "Let me explain what responsibility means to me every time I stand in front of a camera." He paused briefly before continuing. "I understand that people are watching. I understand that what I say and what I do can matter to someone out there. Because of that, I try to bring something honest into the work I do. Something authentic. Something that might actually add something meaningful instead of just tearing people apart." The Joy managed to gather herself enough to respond, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I'm trying to hold people accountable," she said. De Niro stopped pacing and slowly turned toward her. His expression was filled with disbelief. "Accountable," he repeated. "Accountable to who?" "To you." He took a step closer to the desk. "What exactly makes you qualified to hold anyone accountable? What have you built? What have you created? What have you done besides sit behind that desk and criticize people who are actually trying to make something that matters?" Each question landed with sharp force. The atmosphere in the studio grew heavier with every word. Joy's carefully polished public persona appeared to be cracking under the pressure, and everyone watching could sense it. "I've been a journalist for 30 years, she said weakly. "No," De Niro shot back immediately, his voice rising again. "You've been performing for 30 years. There's a difference," he continued before she could respond. "A real journalist looks for truth. A real journalist asks difficult questions because they want real answers, not because they want to create a spectacle. You're not acting like a journalist, Joy. You're acting like a shock jock wearing a pantsuit." A loud gasp rippled through the audience. Several people whispered among themselves while others stared in stunned silence. The energy in the room had shifted dramatically. What had begun as an attempt to challenge a guest had turned into a moment where the host herself was under intense scrutiny. "You want to talk about people being outspoken?" De Niro continued, his voice climbing again as emotion built. "You want to question whether I should use my platform to share my views? Let's talk about how you use yours." He gestured toward the desk where she sat. "Every single day you sit there and spread negativity. Every single day you look for ways to tear someone down. You search for the worst angle in every situation, the harshest interpretation of every comment, just so you can create another argument." He stepped closer, and Joy instinctively leaned back in her chair, as if the intensity of his presence alone pushed her away. "You hide behind the idea that you're being provocative," he went on. "You say you're sparking important discussions. But what you're really doing is feeding the anger and division that's already tearing this country apart. That doesn't help anyone, just makes the problem worse." Joy's voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "That's not fair." "Fair?" De Niro repeated, letting out a short, bitter laugh. "You want to talk about fairness? Was it fair to set me up today? Was it fair to ignore the reason I came here, just so you could chase cheap political points? Was it fair to treat me like I'm supposed to just entertain people and keep quiet about everything else? The other hosts avoided looking at Joy altogether. Their eyes wandered toward the floor, the audience, the cameras, anywhere except the center of the confrontation. You know what I think? Niro said as he leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the desk so he was level with her. I think you're jealous. The statement hung in the air. I think you're bitter because your entire career has been spent talking about other people's accomplishments instead of building any of your own. I think it bothers you to see people who create things, who try to bring something positive into the world. Joy's eyes began to fill with tears, but Niro continued without softening. You built your reputation by being mean? He said bluntly. By saying the things that most people are too decent to say. Somewhere along the line you convinced yourself that makes you brave, that it makes you important. But it doesn't. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. It just makes you sad. The word landed with such finality that the studio remained silent for several long seconds afterward. Sarah Haynes suddenly tried to shift the focus, quickly mentioning Niro's new film in a clear attempt to redirect the conversation. But he raised a hand gently, stopping her before she could continue. I'm not finished, he said calmly, though the tension in his voice remained unmistakable. Joy asked me about responsibility, he continued. So let's talk about hers. He straightened up, towering over the desk as he spoke. Every guest who walks onto this stage is a human being. They have families. They have lives beyond the studio. They have feelings. But you treat them like they're just props in some drama you're trying to create. He looked around the set before returning his gaze to her. You have a responsibility to those people. You have a responsibility to treat them with basic dignity. And you also have a responsibility to your audience to give them something better than this manufactured outrage and fake controversy that exists only to keep ratings high. Joy finally gathered enough resolve to push back slightly. Though her voice still trembled, there was determination behind it. I'm not going to sit here and let you attack me like this. Attack you? Niro repeated, his voice lowering again into that dangerously calm tone. Lady, if I were actually attacking you, you'd know the difference. The quiet intensity in his words carried across the entire set. What I'm doing right now is explaining the mistakes you've been making for years, 'cause apparently no one else around here has had the courage to tell you. He slowly walked back around to his chair but didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, resting his hands on the backrest as though he were addressing a courtroom full of spectators. You want to know what a real interview looks like? He continued. First, you prepare. You take the time to research the person you invited. You learn something about their work and their experiences. Then you ask questions that actually mean something. Questions that might help the audience understand an idea they hadn't considered before or see a situation from another point of view. He paused briefly before continuing. You listen to the answers instead of waiting for your next chance to interrupt. And you treat the person sitting across from you like a human being who deserves respect. The studio had become eerily quiet. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning system seemed loud in comparison to the silence hanging over the room. But most importantly, Niro said as his voice began to rise toward a final point, you remember that your job isn't about making yourself look clever by humiliating someone else. He straightened slightly as he spoke. Your job is to serve the people watching. Your responsibility is to create conversations that actually matter. Conversations that bring something useful into the world instead of adding more pointless noise. Then he turned his gaze directly toward one of the cameras, addressing the viewers at home. To everyone watching this right now, he said, you deserve better than what you're seeing here. You deserve hosts who respect you enough to talk about real issues in a meaningful way. You deserve something better than staged arguments and fake controversies designed to keep people angry and divided. After a moment he looked back toward Joy, who was now openly crying at the desk. And Joy, he said, his tone softening slightly though the seriousness remained, you're capable of doing better than this. Nobody reaches a position like yours without having some talent and intelligence. He shook his head slowly. But somewhere along the line you let your ego take control. You let the desire for attention turn you into something unpleasant. That doesn't have to be permanent. It's not too late to change, but that decision has to come from you. He reached behind the chair and picked up the jacket that had been draped over it. As he slipped it on, the tension in the room remained thick. I came here with the intention of talking about my film, he continued. A project I'm proud of, something that took years of work and the effort of dozens of talented people who gave their time and energy to create something meaningful. He adjusted the sleeves of his jacket. Instead, I walked into an ambush by someone who wanted to use me as a prop in a bit of political theater. He gave a small shrug. Well, the performance is over. At least my part in it. With that, he turned and began walking toward the edge of the set. The audience remained silent, watching every step. Joy suddenly called out, her voice filled with desperation. Where are you going? De Niro paused near the edge of the stage and looked back at her one final time. I'm going back to my life, he replied. I'm going back to doing work that actually means something. He held her gaze for another moment. You might want to think about doing the same. Without another word, Robert De Niro stepped off the set and disappeared from the stage, leaving behind a moment that would instantly become one of the most shocking confrontations ever seen on daytime television. The cameras kept rolling. Joy sat frozen in her chair, tears running down her face. The other hosts looked uncertain and uncomfortable, glancing at one another as they tried to figure out how to fill the remaining broadcast time. No one in the audience spoke. The room was filled with stunned silence, as though everyone present realized they had just witnessed something extraordinary and completely unexpected. For several moments the set remained almost motionless. The energy that had filled the studio during the confrontation now felt heavy and disorienting. Crew members shifted awkwardly behind the cameras while the hosts struggled to regain composure. What had begun as a typical promotional interview had turned into a dramatic clash that exposed the tension often hidden behind the polished surface of daytime television. Viewers across the country would later replay the scene again and again, analyzing every word and every expression. The moment quickly spread across news programs, social media discussions, and entertainment headlines. For many people watching, the confrontation stood out not because of a movie role or scripted performance, but because it felt raw and unfiltered. A Hollywood legend had spoken bluntly in front of millions, challenging the tone and style that often dominates talk show debates. Whether people agreed with him or not, the intensity of those few minutes left a lasting impression. It became one of those rare television moments that audiences would remember long after the broadcast ended, a dramatic collision between celebrity, media, and the unpredictable nature of live television.